called him the Vampire of Sacramento. But this was no nickname born from tabloid headlines or urban legends. This was a man who drank blood, who mutilated corpses, who believed his very organs were decaying inside him and that only fresh blood could save him. And in the winter of 1977, Sacramento, California, would become the hunting ground of Richard Chase. A gaunt, wild-eyed man whose descent into madness is one of the most disturbing sagas in American crime history. But before the blood, before the bodies, before the headlines, there was only silence, a quiet neighborhood, a front door left unlocked, and a predator slipping in under the California sun. This is the story of a man whose thirst could not be quenched, not with water, not with therapy, not even with murder. Richard Chase didn't kill for pleasure. He killed because he thought he was dying. And what makes his case so chilling isn't just the violence. It's the logic that drove it, the unhinged, twisted rationale that made him believe his crimes were necessary for survival. It began, as many of these stories do, with whispers no one heard, a troubled child, a family unable or unwilling to intervene. He was a loner, detached. By his teens, he was already showing signs of severe mental illness. He believed people were trying to poison him, that his heart would stop beating unless he drank the blood of animals. But as the years passed, animals weren't enough. In 1976, Chase was briefly institutionalized. Staff called him Dracula. He was caught smearing blood on his face, found with birds he had caught and killed in his room, and yet, he was eventually deemed not a threat and released. What followed was a rapid, horrifying escalation. Sacramento's cold season was just setting in when Richard Chase committed his first known murder. A drive-by shooting, seemingly random. A test, perhaps. A warm-up. But what came next was anything but random. On January 23, 1978, Richard Chase walked through a quiet Sacramento neighborhood. He wasn't looking for anyone in particular, only for a door that was unlocked. He believed that if a door was locked, it meant he wasn't welcome. But if it was open, that was an invitation. That morning, 51-year-old Teresa Wallen was at home, pregnant, alone. Her husband had just left for work. She was taking out the trash when Chase approached the house. The door was unlocked. What happened next is almost unspeakable. Chase entered, armed with a .22 caliber pistol. He shot Teresa in the hand, then in the head. She fell. He didn't stop there. He dragged her body into the bedroom. He retrieved a butcher knife from her kitchen and mutilated her. And then, he drank her blood. He used a yogurt cup as a makeshift chalice. He later told police he needed her blood because his own was turning to powder, that his stomach was backwards, that his heart would stop beating unless he replenished himself with human organs and plasma. This was no calculated killer. This was someone utterly consumed by delusion. But the results were every bit as horrifying as the most sadistic of murderers. Chase left fingerprints. He left footprints. He didn't care. The police were baffled by the sheer brutality. The scene looked less like a murder and more like a ritual. And he wasn't done. Just 4 days later, on January 27th, Chase struck again. But this time, the scene would be even more chaotic. Because there were multiple victims. Evelyn Maroth was a 38-year-old woman living in a quiet Sacramento suburb. On January 27, 1978, she was babysitting her 22-month-old nephew, David, while also watching over her own 6-year-old son, Jason. Her friend, Dan Meredith, had come by to check in. That morning, Richard Chase showed up at the front door, like before it was unlocked. What happened inside that house is one of the most disturbing mass murders in California history. Chase shot Dan Meredith first, killing him in the hallway. Then he turned his gun on Jason, the 6-year-old boy, and Evelyn. None of them were spared. But the most horrifying part wasn't just the killings. It was what Chase did afterward. He mutilated Evelyn's body in the bathtub. He drained her blood. He took organs with him. He defiled her corpse in ways so grotesque that even seasoned homicide detectives were left shaken. It wasn't just murder, it was consumption, desecration. And baby David? He vanished. At first, police didn't know what had happened to the child, but they feared the worst. And when they found a blood-stained box and diapers at the scene, the horror only deepened. Chase fled the house with body parts, leaving behind fingerprints, blood, and a trail of madness. The scene was chaotic, but it gave investigators a lead. The next day, they issued a bulletin, and a neighbor who had seen someone suspicious earlier that week came forward. The tip would lead them directly to Chase's apartment. When police arrived, what they found inside was a nightmare. Dishes soaked in blood, a blender stained red, pieces of flesh in the fridge. There were signs that Chase had been blending raw organs with Coca-Cola and drinking them. There was no longer any doubt. This wasn't just a murderer. This was a man utterly lost to delusion. A man whose mind had twisted so far inward that he no longer saw people as human, only as fuel. But even then, the full horror hadn't yet come to light, because baby David was still missing. 2 days after the mass murder at Evelyn Maroth's home, police arrested Richard Chase. He didn't resist. He was found wearing a blood-stained parka. In his pockets were Dan Meredith's wallet and a semi-automatic pistol, traced back to the crimes. When they searched his apartment, the evidence was overwhelming. Inside his fridge, they found parts of baby David. Chase confessed, but not in the way you might expect. He didn't see what he did as evil. He insisted he had no choice, that he was being poisoned by Nazis, that his blood was turning to dust, that his organs were decaying. He said he needed blood to live. At his trial, the defense argued insanity, and in any other case, it might have worked. But the prosecution painted a different picture. A killer who knew what he was doing, who bought weapons, who fled the scenes, who tried to avoid being caught. The jury deliberated for 5 hours. Richard Chase was found guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to death in the gas chamber at San Quentin, but he would never make it that far. On December 26, 1980, Richard Chase was found dead in his cell. Suicide. He had stockpiled antidepressants given to him by prison staff and overdosed. He was 30 years old. His death, like his life, left behind more questions than answers. Was he a victim of untreated mental illness ignored by a failing system? Was he born broken, or made that way by isolation, paranoia, and neglect? In the end, the case of Richard Chase is more than just a horror story. It's a haunting reminder that monsters aren't always born in the dark. They can emerge in plain sight, unnoticed until it's far too late. And sometimes, the scariest part isn't what they do. It's that no one stopped them. If your pulse is still steady, you haven't heard enough. Subscribe to Abstract Pulse, where every story bleeds deeper than the last.